Vincent van Gogh, A Sleep Story. There is a small village in the southern Netherlands, a place called Zundert, where the land lies very flat and very still, and the sky above it seems to go on forever in all directions, pale and enormous and full of soft light, even on the quietest winter mornings. The fields around Zundert stretch out in long, even bands of color, deep brown earth and pale straw and the faded green of grasses that do not quite die in the cold, and between those fields there are narrow roads made of packed dirt, roads that wind gently between low hedgerows and the occasional stand of dark pines, roads that lead slowly from one quiet place to another quiet place, without hurry, without noise, just the sound of the wind moving through the flat landscape and the distant call of a bird somewhere above the gray horizon. It was into this stillness that Vincent Willem van Gogh was born, on the 30th of March, in the year 1853, in a small brick house on the main street of Zundert, in the province of North Brabant. The house was modest and warm and smelled of wood smoke and the particular clean damp of a Dutch spring, and outside its windows the world was just beginning to soften at the edges after a long winter, the frost retreating from the fields, the mud beginning to dry along the roadsides, the first tentative green appearing in the hedgerows like a quiet announcement that the cold was almost over. His father, Theodorus van Gogh, was the village pastor, a gentle and serious man who spent his days among his congregation with a kind of patient, steady faith, walking the roads between the scattered farms of Zundert to visit the sick and the old and the troubled, offering what comfort he could in a voice that was always measured and low. His mother, Anna Cornelia, was a woman of considerable warmth and practicality, who kept the household running with a quiet efficiency and who loved to draw and to paint in the manner of Dutch domestic artists, filling small notebooks with careful sketches of plants and birds and the things she saw on her daily walks, and it was from her, perhaps, that her son received his first sense that the world could be looked at with patient, careful attention, that ordinary things, a branch, a cloud, a face, were worth the time it took to really see them. Vincent was the eldest surviving child in the family. There had been another Vincent Willem before him, born exactly a year earlier on the same date, who had lived only a few weeks, and whose small grave in the churchyard of Zundert bore a name that the living child would carry through his whole life, a name he must have passed many hundreds of times as he walked the village roads with his father on those long, slow Sunday afternoons, when the service was over and the congregation had gone home and the churchyard was quiet and the light was low and golden across the flat fields. He grew into a sturdy, quiet boy with red hair and blue eyes and a kind of serious, observant quality about him, a child who preferred to walk alone in the fields and heathlands around Zundert rather than play with the other children of the village, who spent long hours simply looking at things, at beetles and birds' nests and the particular way that light fell through the leaves of the big chestnut trees that lined the road to the parsonage, and who sometimes brought things home with him. Small treasures of the natural world, a piece of interestingly shaped bark, a feather, a smooth pebble from the stream, things that he would arrange on the windowsill of his small room and look at in the changing light of different hours of the day. The parsonage itself was a comfortable, sheltered place, surrounded by a garden that his mother tended with great care through all the seasons, a garden full of flowers in summer, roses and sweet peas and tall blue delphiniums, and bare and clean and beautiful in winter, the dark branches of the trees tracing patterns against the pale sky that a more observant visitor might have recognized as drawings in their own right, elegant and precise. The house had a good library, full of the serious books that a Dutch pastor in the 1850s might be expected to own, theology and history and moral philosophy and the Dutch poets, and also, because his parents were cultivated people with an appreciation for the arts, a collection of prints and engravings that hung on the walls in simple frames, reproductions of Dutch and Flemish masters, quiet domestic scenes and landscapes and portraits of plain-faced people going about their days. With a kind of dignified ordinariness that the young Vincent absorbed without quite knowing he was absorbing it. He walked these fields for years, growing slowly from a quiet child into a quiet young man, and the landscape of North Brabant settled into him the way that childhood landscapes always do, becoming part of the texture of how he understood the world, becoming a kind of internal country that he would carry with him everywhere he went for the rest of his life, the flatness of it, the bigness of the sky, the way the light came low and sideways across the land in the late afternoons of autumn, the particular smell of turned earth in spring and of heather in summer and of wood smoke in winter, the sound of the wind moving across a field with nothing to stop it for miles and miles in every direction. He spent the seasons of his childhood moving between the parsonage and the countryside, between the warm interior world of books and prints and family conversation and the vast, quiet exterior world of the flat Brabant landscape, and both of these worlds gave him things that he would carry always. From the interior world he received language and story and the sense that ideas mattered and that the life of the mind was worth tending. From the exterior world he received color and light and space and the habit of looking, the habit of standing very still in a field or at the edge of a wood and letting the world arrange itself before him in all its ordinary and inexhaustible particularity. He noticed things that other children walked past without pausing, the way a spider's web beaded with morning dew caught the low angle of autumn sunlight and held it like a net full of small stars, the way the heather on the moor changed color as the clouds moved across the sky above it, now dull and gray-brown and then suddenly vivid purple as a shaft of light broke through and fell directly on it, the way the frozen surface of a pond in January held the reflections of bare trees and winter. Sky in a perfect, upside-down world that looked both like the real world and completely unlike it. He collected these moments the way some children collect stamps or buttons, carrying them home in his memory and turning them over in quiet evenings by the lamp, and they fed something in him that was growing steadily and would eventually need much more than a childhood in Zundert could contain. He went to the village school in Zundert, and then, when he was 11 years old, he was sent away to boarding school in Zevenbergen, a nearby town, and the separation from his family and from the flat familiar landscape of his childhood was the first of many separations he would experience in his life, and each one would leave its mark in the same quiet, patient way that water marks stone, slowly and deeply and without drama. He was not unhappy at school, exactly, but he was not happy either, in the uncomplicated way that some children are happy. And he remembered the day his parents' carriage disappeared around the corner on the road back to Zundert as one of those moments that lodge themselves in the memory and do not leave, one of those moments when the world seems to rearrange itself slightly and nothing afterward is quite the same as it was before. He studied at the boarding school for 2 years, and then at a secondary school in Tilburg called the King Willem II School, where he took drawing lessons from a teacher named Constantijn Huysmans, a man who had been trained in the academic tradition and who gave his young pupils exercises in shading and proportion and the careful observation of objects placed before them on a table. Vincent was good at this. He had always been good at looking, and the translation of looking into marks on paper came to him with a naturalness that surprised no one who knew how much time he had spent as a child simply standing in a field or a garden, watching the way things were. But the formal schooling did not continue. When he was 15, his parents withdrew him from the school in Tilburg, and he came home to the parsonage in Zundert for a year, a quiet year of uncertain direction, of long walks along the familiar roads and in the familiar fields, of reading and drawing and helping around the house, of waiting for some shape to emerge from the formlessness of an uncertain future. And then, in the summer of 1869, when he was 16 years old, a shape did emerge, a direction did present itself, and it came through the family connection that would define the next several years of his life. His uncle, also named Vincent, was a partner in the art-dealing firm of Gogh and Sy, one of the most important art dealerships in Europe, with branches in Paris and London and Brussels and New York, and it was his uncle who arranged for the young Vincent to begin work as a junior employee at the Hague branch of the firm, starting in the summer of his 16th year, handling prints and paintings and drawings in a world that was, in its way, continuous with the world of looking and noticing. That he had been practicing all his quiet childhood. The Hague was a larger, more formal city than anything he had known in Zundert or Zevenbergen, a city of wide boulevards and civic buildings and the dignified residences of the professional classes, a city that also had, at its edges and in its surrounding countryside, the kind of flat, atmospheric Dutch landscape that he had grown up in, the same wide skies and wet fields and long horizons. The same quality of northern light that seemed to come from everywhere at once, soft and grey and full. Of subtle gradations that rewarded patient looking. He found lodgings near the firm and began his working life, learning the business of art from the inside, handling pictures the way a librarian handles books, with care and familiarity and a growing sense of which things mattered and why. He was good at the work. He was diligent and he was knowledgeable and he had a genuine enthusiasm for the paintings and prints in the firm's stock, an enthusiasm that was not commercial but aesthetic, not professional but personal, the enthusiasm of someone for whom looking at a picture was not a transaction but an experience. He read voraciously during these years, working his way through the literature that surrounded and explained the art he was handling, learning the names and the histories and the characteristic qualities of Dutch and Flemish masters, learning also about the French painters who were beginning to reshape the art of Europe, learning about Corot and Millet and the Barbizon school, painters who went into the fields and the forests to find their subjects, who painted the world of ordinary labor and ordinary light with a directness and a tenderness that moved him deeply. He walked the Dutch countryside in every season, and the flat, wet, atmospheric landscapes of the Netherlands filled his eyes and his memory with a palette of grey and silver and brown and the particular deep green of Dutch fields under a cloudy sky, colors that he would return to again and again in his imagination even when he was far away. Colors that for him meant something specific and personal about the nature of the world and of human life in it. The quiet beauty of ordinary things seen clearly and with full attention. He transferred to the London branch of Gogh in May of 1873, when he was 20 years old, and London was a revelation and an education of a different kind. He found lodgings in Brixton, in the south of the city, in the house of a widow named Ursula Lohier who took in boarders, and he was happy there in a way he had not quite been happy before, happy in the particular way of a young man who is living on his own for the first time and finding the world larger and more interesting than he had imagined. He walked London extensively, as he had walked the Dutch countryside. But the city offered different pleasures, different kinds of looking, the Thames and its bridges and its working life, the parks with their elm trees and their wandering paths, the museums and galleries that opened before him like rooms full of everything that had ever been painted or drawn or sculpted, available to anyone who walked in from the street. He went to the National Gallery many times, and the pictures there settled into him the way the Dutch landscapes had settled into him in childhood, becoming internal furniture, part of the permanent collection of images that he carried inside himself. He loved the Dutch and Flemish masters he already knew from The Hague, but London showed him new things, showed him Constable's enormous, atmospheric English skies and Turner's luminous, dissolving visions of light and water, showed him the English landscape painters who had learned to look at ordinary weather as if it were a kind of miracle. And he was moved by all of this in a way that went beyond appreciation into something more personal and more fundamental. He walked London in all weathers, and London in all weathers was an education in itself, a city that wore its atmospheric conditions like a changing costume, fog and drizzle and occasional bursts of pale sunshine cycling through in rapid succession, the Thames dark and silvery and sometimes almost golden in the afternoons. The parks full of the very English combination of mud and green grass and the distant sound of children playing somewhere beyond a line of elms. He walked from Brixton northward through Camberwell and Peckham and across the river to the museums and galleries of Kensington, and then sometimes further east to the city and the great muddy reach of the Thames below London Bridge, where the working boats moved slowly in the current and the gulls hung in the air above them. And he absorbed all of it, the visual richness of a great city going about its enormous and complicated life. He was also reading deeply during these years, reading Dickens and George Eliot and the English novelists who wrote about ordinary life with extraordinary sympathy, who created worlds on the page in which the lives of working people and people who did not fit comfortably into the social order were treated with dignity and attention and care, and this reading shaped him in ways that were complementary to what the paintings were doing, filling him with a sense that the subjects of art, the things worth looking at, the things worth writing about, were everywhere, in the fields and the streets and the faces of ordinary people going about their ordinary days. He remained in London for 2 years, and they were years of gradual opening, years in which the world grew larger and more complex and more beautiful and more painful in more or less equal measure. There were small unhappinesses and small joys and the large steady comfort of work and walking and reading and looking, and when he returned to the continent, first briefly to Paris in 1875 and then to positions in England and Holland that carried less and less of the enthusiasm he had once brought to his work at Gogh, he was already beginning to change in ways that would eventually lead him far from the art trade and into the art itself. His faith, which had always been present in the background of his life as the son of a Dutch Reformed pastor, began during these years to move into the foreground, to become not merely an inherited background condition but an active and urgent concern, a need to understand what he was meant to do in the world and for the world and with the particular combination of feelings and perceptions and capacities that he seemed to have been given. He read theology, he read the Bible, he read Thomas à Kempis and John Bunyan and the devotional literature of several centuries, and he began to feel that what he really wanted was not to sell pictures but to serve people, to be of some use to those who were suffering and poor and left behind by a world that moved too fast and cared too little for the ones it was leaving. He left Gogh in the spring of 1876, not entirely by his own choice, and spent a difficult year in England teaching at schools and working in a bookshop and beginning his studies for the ministry, preaching occasionally to small congregations in the Methodist tradition, finding in the act of preaching a kind of release for the intensity of feeling that had been building in him for years, a feeling that had nowhere quite to go in the quiet routines of the art trade. He spoke to small groups in the evenings, in plain rooms lit by a few candles or an oil lamp, about the beauty and the suffering he saw in the world around him, about the fields and the workers and the light, and something in the way he spoke moved people, though the institutional church would ultimately decide that he was not cut out for formal ministry. He returned to the Netherlands at the end of 1876 and spent time studying in Amsterdam, attempting to prepare for the university entrance examinations that would qualify him for theological training, sitting for long hours over Greek and Latin and theology in a small room in his uncle's house, struggling with the formal academic disciplines in a way that someone with his particular kind of intelligence, intuitive, visual, emotional, deeply attentive to the specific and the concrete, might predictably struggle. He persevered for a year and a half, and then gave up the classical route and tried a shorter training program in Brussels, and when that also failed to take hold, he found another way entirely. In the winter of 1878 and into 1879, he went to the Borinage, a coal mining region in the south of Belgium, as a lay preacher and missionary, living among the miners and their families in conditions of real poverty, in a small hut without many comforts, giving away his own food and clothing to people who were poorer than he was, washing the wounds of injured miners and sitting with the sick and the dying in their dark little houses at the bottom of the hills. Below the slag heaps, doing the work that he had been trying to find his way toward for years, the work of being genuinely useful to people who needed it. The Borinage was a dark and serious place, a landscape unlike anything he had grown up in, not the flat open land of North Brabant but a landscape of hills and valleys made strange by the black heaps of coal waste that rose above every village like the discards of some enormous and indifferent machine, and the people who lived in it were marked by their work in ways that were visible and profound, their faces and their hands blackened by the coal dust that went down into everything, their bodies shaped by years of crouching and hauling in narrow underground passages, their lives lived between the darkness of the mine and the darkness of small, cold, damp houses that never quite dried out in the long Belgian winters. He moved into the life of the community as fully as he was able, sharing its conditions not as an observer but as a participant, doing what he could to be genuinely useful rather than merely well-intentioned, and what he found in doing so was something that no formal theological training had quite prepared him for, which was the way that suffering and dignity coexist in actual human lives. The way that people in genuinely hard circumstances retain nonetheless a quality of perseverance and even grace that is entirely real and entirely admirable, that does not need to be romanticized or explained away but simply recognized and honored. He recognized it and he honored it, in the only way available to him, by looking at it steadily and with full attention and by trying to record what he saw with as much honesty and care as he could manage. He drew them. He had been drawing all his life, sketching in notebooks and on whatever paper came to hand, but it was in the Borinage that drawing became something more urgent and more purposeful, not a pleasant hobby or a professional skill but a way of understanding, a way of paying attention that was as serious and as necessary as prayer. He drew the miners going to work in the early morning darkness, their lamps moving in long lines up the road to the mine shaft, their silhouettes against the grey pre-dawn sky making a kind of processional that was both grim and beautiful, that combined the specific facts of poverty and labor with something that transcended the specific, something that had to do with the dignity and the patience of human beings making their way through difficult lives. He drew the women and the old men who picked through the slag heaps for pieces of coal that had been missed, bent figures against the black landscape doing slow and difficult work for very small returns, and he drew the interiors of the miners' houses, the low ceilings and the small fires and the tired faces around the table, and everything he drew had in it the same quality that would characterize all his best work years later. The quality of looking without sentimentality, of recording what was actually there without embellishment or evasion, but also without coldness, without the clinical remove of someone who did not care, because he cared deeply, cared in a way that showed in every mark he made. The church authorities decided that he was too eccentric, too unorthodox, too much himself to represent their institution, and they declined to renew his appointment in the baronage. He stayed anyway for a while, living in increasing poverty and isolation, and then gradually, slowly, over a period of months in which his correspondence with his younger brother Theo, the letters that would eventually constitute one of the great bodies of personal writing in European literature, became the primary thread connecting him to the larger world. He began to understand that what he was meant to do was not to preach but to paint, not to speak about the world he saw and felt but to render it directly, to put it on paper and canvas with his own hands, to make the looking into the thing itself. Theo was living in Paris by this time, working for Goupil just as Vincent had done, but succeeding at it in the way that Vincent had not quite managed, succeeding with a steadiness and a social grace that Vincent admired without envy, because his feeling for his younger brother was uncomplicated by competition, was simply love, the kind of love that is also a form of recognition, the feeling of having found in another person the one who really understands. Theo supported him financially for most of the rest of his life, sending monthly allowances that were modest but consistent, that made it possible for Vincent to buy paint and canvas and the basic necessities of a working life, and in return Vincent sent paintings and drawings and the letters, those long, extraordinary letters full of descriptions of things he had seen and thoughts he had had and books he had read and painters he admired. Letters that read today as a kind of parallel autobiography, a record of an inner life of extraordinary richness and intensity. He went back to his parents in Eton in the spring of 1881, having decided definitively to be an artist, and began to work in earnest, drawing from life with a dedication and a seriousness that were new even for him, hiring labourers from the surrounding countryside to come and sit for him, drawing their faces and their hands and their bodies with a patient, insistent attention, making dozens of drawings and then hundreds of drawings, covering sheet after sheet with figures and faces and landscapes and the interiors of cottages, building slowly and with great deliberateness the technical vocabulary he would need to say what he wanted to say. He was 27 years old when he made this decision, older than most art students by a decade, and he knew that he was starting late and that he would have to work harder and longer and with less margin for distraction than someone who had begun at the normal age, and this knowledge gave his work an urgency and a focus that were entirely characteristic of the way he did everything, the all-or-nothing quality of someone who had found, after years of searching, the thing he was meant to do, and was not going to waste any more time. He moved to The Hague in the winter of 1881 and 82, renting a studio in the city and beginning to work with a serious professional discipline, rising early and working through the day and late into the evenings, filling the studio with drawings and then beginning to experiment with paint, with watercolor and oil, with the materials that would eventually become his natural medium. He went to drawing classes and he visited the studios of professional artists and he looked at everything, at the art that was being made around him in the Netherlands and at the reproductions of French and English work that he could find in the print shops and the illustrated magazines of the period. He was not an easy man to be around during these years. He was intense and single-minded in a way that could be difficult for people who did not share his intensity, and his social relations were often complicated by the gap between what he felt and what he was able to express in ordinary conversation, a gap that seemed to close only when he was talking about pictures or about the people he painted, the subjects of his art, about whom he could speak with great clarity and great feeling. He loved deeply and clumsily and sometimes inappropriately, and the difficulties of his emotional life during these years were real and sometimes painful, but they were also part of the same fundamental quality that made him what he was, the quality of feeling everything very strongly and not being able to turn it down or manage it with the social skill that smooths the surfaces of more conventional lives. He worked through the winter in The Hague, drawing and painting with increasing confidence, and in the spring he began to paint outdoors, taking his materials out into the streets and the markets and the allotment gardens at the edges of the city, painting the everyday scenes of Dutch urban life with the same directness and attention that he brought to his figure drawings, trying to catch the light of the northern sky on the wet pavements and the grey facades and the gardens where old men sat in the afternoons on wooden benches and smoked their pipes in the spring sunshine. He was developing his eye during these years in the way that a musician develops an ear, practicing constantly, returning to the same problems and the same subjects from slightly different angles, learning what he could do and what he could not yet do, learning the difference between a drawing that recorded what he saw and a drawing that communicated what he felt about what he saw, which is a much harder thing to learn and one that can only come through enormous amounts of practice and a willingness to fail repeatedly without becoming discouraged. He was not easily discouraged. He was stubborn in the way that certain kinds of strength express themselves as stubbornness, the refusal to be turned back by difficulty, the capacity to try again and again and again without losing faith that eventually the work would get better and the thing he was reaching for would come within reach. He left The Hague in the autumn of 1883 and went north, into the province of Drenthe, into a landscape that was unlike anything he had painted before, a landscape of vast, flat heathlands and peat bogs stretching to the horizon under enormous skies, almost unpopulated, entirely undecorated by the human arrangements that a Dutch city or a Dutch village creates against the rawness of the natural world. He went there to be alone with the landscape, to paint it without interruption, to see how far he could push his understanding of light and space and color when there were no other concerns competing for his attention. Drenthe was lonely and beautiful and very old, a landscape that seemed unchanged by the centuries, the peat bog workers who moved slowly across the flat land in the low light of autumn afternoons looking as if they might have been there forever, as if the landscape had generated them the way it generated the heather and the occasional stunted pine, as natural features of the place rather than people passing through it on their way to somewhere else. He painted them the way he had drawn the miners of the Borinage, with the same patient and tender attention, the same refusal to look away from the difficulty and the dignity of hard physical work done in difficult conditions by people who had very little except the work itself and the land they worked. He was alone in Drenthe for 3 months, and the loneliness of it deepened him in ways he did not entirely welcome at the time, ways he would only understand later. He wrote long letters to Theo about what he was seeing and painting, about the color of the heather in the autumn light and the quality of the sky at different hours of the day and the effect of mist on the flat horizon in the early mornings, letters that were also, between the lines, expressions of a loneliness that was becoming too large to be entirely comfortable, too large for the work alone to fill. He went home to his parents at Christmas of 1883, and this time his parents had moved from Zundert to a new posting in the village of Nwijnen, in the same province of North Brabant, and it was in Nwijnen that he would spend the next 2 years of his life, the years in which his early style reached its fullest, darkest, most characteristic expression. Weenen was a small village, quieter even than Zundert, surrounded by flat agricultural land where weavers worked at their looms in low cottages and peasant farmers worked the potato fields in all weathers with a slow, seasonal patience that seemed as ancient as the land itself. He settled into the village and began to paint its people and its landscape with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything, hiring the local farmers and weavers and their wives and children to sit for him, painting them in their cottages and their fields and their gardens, building up a body of work about peasant life in the Netherlands that was, in its quiet and serious way, one of the most concentrated records of a particular kind of human life that the art of the period produced. The studio he set up in Weenen was a small space given over entirely to work, every surface covered with paintings and drawings in various stages of completion, the walls hung with the Japanese prints and reproductions of Dutch and French masters that he pinned up for reference and for company, the table covered with brushes and paint tubes and the small objects that he arranged into still lives. Potatoes and onions and root vegetables that he painted with the same attention and care he brought to human faces, because for him there was no hierarchy of worthy subjects, only the world as it was, which was entirely worthy of attention in all its manifestations. He painted the weavers at their looms, those great wooden machines that filled the small cottages almost completely, the weaver sitting at the center of an intricate geometry of threads and levers and moving parts, surrounded by the loom the way a spider is surrounded by its web, the work entirely absorbing, entirely rhythmic, entirely contained within the small space of the cottage and the smaller space of the loom itself. The weavers fascinated him as subjects because of this quality of complete absorption, of a human being entirely given over to a single repeated motion in a small, specific place, and the paintings he made of them have a concentrated, still quality that reflects this, the dark cottages and the dark wood of the looms and the dark clothes of the weavers all combining into a single, unified tone that is both austere and deeply warm. The palette of the Weenen paintings is the palette of the Dutch landscape in autumn and winter, the palette of earth and shadow and the filtered grey-brown light of cloudy northern afternoons, a palette that bears no resemblance to what he would be doing a few years later in the south of France, but that has its own austere beauty, its own kind of truth about the world as he was seeing it in those years. The colors are the colors of the soil and the smoke and the dark wood of old furniture and the worn fabric of old clothes, colors that carry in them the entire history of Dutch painting from Rembrandt forward, the tradition of finding in darkness and in ordinary things a kind of luminosity that does not require brightness to be real. The most important painting of the Weenen years, the work that drew together everything he had been learning and practicing and thinking about during 5 years of serious artistic effort, was The Potato Eaters, completed in the spring of 1885. It is a large and dark and serious picture of a peasant family gathered around a table in the dim light of a single hanging lamp, eating potatoes from a communal dish and drinking coffee, 5 figures in a low-ceilinged cottage interior, their faces rough and expressive and entirely real, their hands, he paid particular attention to the hands, large and knotted and dark with the earth they had worked all day to produce the modest meal now on the table before them. He prepared for this painting with great deliberateness and care, making many studies of the individual figures and their hands and the interior of the cottage, thinking carefully about the composition and the light and the color, wanting the picture to communicate something specific and important about the dignity of manual labor and the seriousness of ordinary life, wanting it to feel not like an observation from the outside but like an entry into the actual interior of a way of life, as if the viewer were sitting at the table with the family in the dim light, sharing the meal and the silence. He sent the painting to Theo in Paris, and Theo showed it to some of the painters and dealers he knew, and the response was mixed, as the response to his work would often be, some people finding in it the qualities he had intended and others finding it too dark, too rough, too unpolished in comparison with the smooth academic painting that still dominated the official art world of the period. But for Vincent the picture was a kind of proof, a demonstration to himself that he could do what he was trying to do, that the years of practice and looking and thinking had brought him to a place where he could make, in a single large and serious work, something that said what he wanted to say about the world he was living in and the people he was living among. He continued to paint through the rest of 1885 with the energy of someone who has found his footing and is no longer uncertain about the direction of travel. He painted landscapes, the flat fields of North Brabant in autumn and winter, the old church at Nwenen seen across the churchyard in a November light, the lane of poplars running along the edge of the village in a fading afternoon, the birds' nests he collected from the hedgerows and painted in careful studies of interlaced twigs and leaves, finding in their small, intricate construction the same quality of patience and purpose that he found in the work of the weavers. He left Nwenen in November of 1885, following his sense that he needed to see more of the art world than the rural Netherlands could offer, and went to Antwerp, which was a larger city and a more complicated one, a port city full of movement and variety and the kind of busy visual noise that was entirely different from the quiet countryside he had been painting. He enrolled in the art academy there, drawing from classical casts and from life in the formal academic tradition, finding the instruction largely unhelpful but finding in Antwerp itself an education of a different kind, in the museums and in the streets, in the work of the great Flemish painters, Rubens above all, and in the Japanese woodblock prints that he found in the print shops near the harbour, prints that had been arriving in Europe for a generation and that were changing the way European artists thought about color and composition and the relationship between line and surface. He was captivated by the Japanese prints. He bought them in quantities and pinned them to the walls of his Antwerp studio and looked at them for hours, studying the way the Japanese artists used flat areas of bright, unmodulated color, the way they simplified form into clear outlines and bold shapes, the way they found beauty in unexpected subjects, a wave, a plum blossom, a view of a mountain glimpsed between the rooftops, with a directness and a confidence and a delight in the visible world that felt entirely different from anything in the European tradition he had grown up with, and that felt, at the same time, strangely familiar, strangely close to something he had been reaching toward without knowing quite what it was. He went to Paris in February of 1886, going to live with Theo, who had by this time established himself in an apartment on the Rue Larvel and then on the Rue Lepic in Montmartre, the hilly neighborhood on the northern edge of Paris that had become the center of the new art that was remaking everything. Paris in 1886 was electric with the energy of artistic change, charged with the arguments and the experiments and the ambitions of a generation of painters who were doing things with color and light that had never quite been done before, painters who were looking at the world not in the conventional way of academic tradition but with fresh eyes, with the eyes of people who had been outdoors in the actual light of the actual sun and had seen things there that their studios had not prepared them for. He spent 2 years in Paris, from February of 1886 to February of 1888, and those 2 years changed him as completely as any experience of his life, changed the color of his palette from the dark browns and blacks and gray-greens of Nwenen to the bright, singing blues and yellows and oranges and reds that would characterize the work of his last years, the work for which he is now known and loved around the world. He met the Impressionists, or at least the artists who were associated with the Impressionist movement and with the newer movements that were growing out of it, met Pissarro and Degas and Toulouse-Lautrec and Émile Bernard and Gauguin, and each meeting added something to the accumulating picture of what painting could be and what he wanted it to be. He studied the way Monet and the Impressionists used small touches of pure color to build up surfaces that shimmered with light, the way they painted the same subject at different times of day to show how light changed everything, the way they trusted the eye's ability to synthesize colored marks into the impression of solid things. He studied Seurat's methodical system of tiny dots of pure color placed beside each other to create vibrant optical mixtures, the scientific approach to the phenomena that the Impressionists had discovered intuitively. He studied the way color could be used not merely to describe what things looked like but to express what they felt like, to communicate an emotional state as directly as music communicated it, without the intermediary of words or the conventions of representation. He painted the hill of Montmartre and its windmills, still standing then on the heights above the city, turning slowly in the Parisian wind against a sky that was blue or gray or full of cloud depending on the season, and the windmills had something of the Dutch landscape in them that gave him a strange comfort, a sense of home in an unfamiliar city. He painted the gardens and the parks in all their seasonal changes, the chestnut trees coming into leaf in spring and the roses blooming in the Tuileries in summer and the autumn colors deepening through October into the bare winter branches, each change in the landscape outside asking something different of the palette inside the studio. He and Theo lived closely together during these years, sharing the apartment on the Rue Lepic with a companionable tolerance for each other's habits and needs that was the result of genuine affection and genuine understanding on both sides, each knowing the other's strengths and difficulties and making room for both. Theo worked long days at the gallery and came home in the evenings to find the studio full of new canvases drying against every available wall, and he received them with the steady, faithful enthusiasm that was his great gift to his brother, the ability to see what Vincent was doing and to believe in it even when no one else quite did. His palette began to lighten and to warm. The dark earthy tones of the Netherlands gave way gradually to higher-keyed, more chromatic colors, to the ochres and cadmiums and cobalts and viridians that would become his characteristic materials, and the way he put color on the canvas began to change too, becoming more active, more energized, the brushstrokes more visible and more expressive, each mark carrying more of the feeling behind it, the paint building up in layers and ridges on the canvas surface that were as much about the physical act of painting as they were about the subject being painted. He painted the city and the people in it, painted the views from Theo's apartment window and the streets below and the cafes and the parks and the gardens of Montmartre, and he also painted his own face, repeatedly, in a long series of self-portraits that were partly a practical solution to the problem of finding a model who was always available and cost nothing, and partly a more serious kind of investigation. A sustained examination of a single face seen from the inside and recorded from the outside, the face of a man in his early 30s who was working very hard and living with great intensity and who was beginning to understand what he was and what he was capable of. Paris was also physically demanding and sometimes overwhelming. The city was loud and fast and full of people and social obligations and the particular kind of argument about art that the Paris art world specialized in, argument that was sometimes productive and stimulating and sometimes merely exhausting, and after 2 years of it Vincent felt the need for quiet, for space, for the kind of sustained, uninterrupted looking that had been possible in the flat fields of North Brabant but was difficult in the noise and bustle of Montmartre. He had been reading about Provence, about the south of France, about the quality of the Mediterranean light there, which artists who had been there described as something entirely different from anything he had experienced in the north, a light of extraordinary clarity and intensity, a light that seemed to illuminate the world from the inside rather than from above, and he wanted to see it. He left Paris in February of 1888 and took the train south to Arles, a small city in the flat delta country of the Rhône River, near the coast of Provence, arriving in the early morning after a long night's journey to find the landscape covered in snow, which was unusual for that region and which must have been startling after what he had been expecting, but which was also, in its way, beautiful. The same landscape that would become brilliant with sun and color in the weeks and months ahead, now quiet and still and white under a gray winter sky. Arles itself was a small, old Roman city, its center still surrounded by fragments of the ancient walls and the great Roman arena and the ruins of the baths and the theater, a city that wore its long history lightly, its daily life unimpressed by the monuments that tourists came from elsewhere to look at, its market days and its cafe evenings and its farm business proceeding according to the practical rhythms of a southern French agricultural town that had been going about this business since before the Romans built their arena. He found a cafe that would let him leave his things and then found a room in a simple hotel, and the next morning, when the snow was beginning to melt under a pale winter sun, he went out to see what he had come to see. The light was different. He had been told it would be different, and it was different in a way that confirmed everything he had hoped for and also suggested possibilities he had not anticipated. The light in Arles, even in February, even with the last of the snow still on the ground and the Mistral wind blowing cold off the mountains to the north, had a quality of sharp clarity that was unlike anything he had experienced in the grey light of the Netherlands or the diffuse, tonal light of Paris, a quality that made colors look more themselves than they did in the north, made the shadows on white walls a sharp, singing blue, made the bare trees against the sky look drawn rather than painted, each branch precise and particular against the pale winter blue. He began to paint immediately, going out into the landscape around the city with his easel and his paints, working in the orchards that surrounded Arles, which in late February and early March were just beginning to bloom, almond trees first, then peach trees, then apple and pear and cherry, wave after wave of blossom advancing through the landscape as the weeks passed and the temperature rose and the light intensified. He painted the blossoming orchards with a joy and a speed that was new in his work, 14 canvases in 2 weeks, the paint going on quickly and confidently, the pale pink and white of the blossoms against the blue sky or the green fields capturing something about the quality of that particular light and that particular moment of the year that he had never quite managed to capture before. He was looking for a permanent studio, somewhere he could work without the inconvenience and expense of a hotel, and in May of 1888 he found it, a small yellow house on the Place Lamartine at the edge of the old city, a 4-room house that he rented for 15 francs a month and that he immediately began to furnish and paint and prepare for the kind of life he wanted to live there, the life of a working artist in a simple, purposeful space with everything arranged for the maximum comfort of the work. He painted the house itself, the yellow facade against the blue sky, the cobblestones of the square in front of it, the gas lamps just coming on in the early evening light, and the painting of the yellow house became one of his most enduring images, a record of a place that for a few months was the center of everything he hoped for. He furnished the yellow house with the focused simplicity of someone who knows exactly what he needs and is not interested in what he does not need: a bed, a table, some chairs, a few Japanese prints on the walls, the large stock of canvas and paint and brushes that were the real furniture of his life. He painted his bedroom, painted it to show the quality of rest and peace that he intended the room to convey, the wooden bed and the chairs and the simple table and the window looking out onto the street, all arranged in a composition of deep blues and oranges and yellows that conveyed not the literal appearance of the room but its emotional character, the way it felt to be in a simple, clean, purposeful space after a long day of working in the heat and light of Provence. He painted isles in every light and season, following the sun through its daily arc and the year through its seasonal changes with a devotion that was almost religious, going out in the early morning before the heat became too intense, working through the long, brilliant summer afternoons with the sun burning down on the flat landscape and the cicadas loud in every tree and hedge, continuing sometimes into the evenings when the light changed from gold to orange and then to the deep blue of the southern night. He painted sunflowers, not once but in repeated series, great vases of them arranged on the table in the yellow house, their golden heads turned toward the light in ways that seemed to him to express something fundamental about the nature of life and of growing things, something about the orientation of living matter toward light that was both botanical fact and metaphor. The sunflower paintings were done in the full heat of August, in a studio that was itself like a furnace in the Provençal summer, and the paint went on thick and fast and with the confident urgency of someone who knew what he was after and was finding it in every stroke, the yellows ranging from pale lemon to deep ochre and burnt orange, each flower in the vase a different temperature of yellow, each head a different angle, each turned face of petals a different variation on the single theme of yellow light reaching toward more yellow light, sun calling to sun across the warm interior of a white-walled room in a small city in the south of France. He painted 4 vases of sunflowers, then another 4, working with a speed that astonished even himself, drying one canvas while he worked on the next, filling the studio with the smell of linseed oil and turpentine and the particular warm, slightly musty sweetness of fresh sunflowers in a ceramic vase. He painted the Rhône River at night, setting up his easel on the bank under the stars and working by the light of candles stuck to the brim of his hat, an image that is almost comical in the abstract but that produced one of his most beautiful paintings, the river dark and still and reflecting the lights of the town and the lights of the stars above, the night sky not black but a deep, luminous blue full of color, the yellow and orange of the gas lamps on the quay turning the water to something that looked like hammered gold, the whole scene so full of light even in darkness that it seemed to argue against the conventional assumption that night was simply the absence of what day contained. He had written to Gogh, the painter he had met in Paris, and had been trying for months to persuade him to come to Arles to form the studio community that he imagined and hoped for, the community of artists working together in the South that he called the Studio of the South, a place where painters could support each other and exchange ideas and work side by side in the extraordinary light of Provence. Gogh agreed eventually, arriving in October of 1888, and the 2 months they spent together in the Yellow House were a period of intense activity and also of intense difficulty, 2 strong personalities with fundamentally different ideas about art and life living in a small space under the pressure of very high expectations. The arrangement ended badly, in the circumstances that everyone who knows anything about Van Gogh knows about, circumstances that he himself understood to be a kind of crisis, a breaking point, something that happened in the territory between exhaustion and despair, and that left him hospitalized and uncertain about the future. It is not necessary to linger on the details of those difficult nights, because they are not what defines him, not what gives his work its meaning and its power. What defines him is the painting, the extraordinary paintings that he made in the weeks and months before and after and all around those difficult nights, paintings that show a world full of beauty and meaning and the specific, irreplaceable quality of light falling on particular things in particular places at particular times of day. He went voluntarily to the St. Paul de Morceau Asylum at St. Remy de Provence in May of 1889, seeking rest and a supervised environment that might help him manage the episodes that had disrupted the last months of his life in Arles, and what he found there was also a kind of freedom, the freedom of a large walled garden and the surrounding countryside and the long, uninterrupted hours that institutional life, paradoxically, made available for work. He was allowed to paint, both in the garden and in a small room that had been set aside as a studio, and he painted with a sustained, productive intensity through the year he spent at St. Remy, producing over 150 paintings and a comparable number of drawings, one of the most productive years in the life of any artist. Working from nature and from imagination and from the reproductions of other artists' work that Theo sent him from Paris. The daily rhythm of the asylum was simple and regular, and its very regularity was, for a while, a kind of comfort. He woke in the mornings to the same view from the same window, the same garden below and the same hills beyond the garden wall and the same wide Provençal sky above the hills, and in this sameness there was something steady and reliable that his life in Arles had sometimes lacked, something that made it possible to give the full force of his attention to the work without the distraction of all the small decisions and negotiations that an independent life requires. He ate his meals in the communal dining room and walked in the garden in the hours when painting was not possible and read in his room in the evenings by the light of a lamp, and the days arranged themselves around the work with a satisfying simplicity. The garden of the asylum was a beautiful and melancholy place, its paths lined with tall pines and cypresses and its flower bed somewhat neglected, the flowers growing in a comfortable disorder that was different from the cultivated precision of a formal garden, more like a wild thing that had once been tamed and was slowly returning to its natural state. He painted the garden in all its moods and seasons, the irises in the spring, the roses in summer, the cypress trees that rose like dark flames against the sky, their spiraling form expressing something about the upward reach of growing things that seemed to him both beautiful and true. He could see the wheat fields beyond the wall from his room window, and he watched them through the year, watched the green of spring deepen into summer and then ripen through July into the gold of harvest, and he painted what he saw with a directness and an immediacy that came from the fact that the view was always there, always available, always showing him something he had not quite seen before even though he had been looking at it for months. The wheat fields under different skies, a clear blue summer sky, a grey and overcast autumn sky, a winter sky pale and flat and full of diffuse northern light, became a kind of ongoing meditation on the relationship between a fixed subject and the changing conditions that fall upon it, the way the same field can look entirely different in different light and yet be entirely the same field, the way the world is both constant and endlessly variable in ways that reward sustained attention. He painted through the St. Remy year with an increasing mastery of a style that was becoming entirely his own, a style in which the brushstroke was not a means to an end but an end in itself, each stroke visible and purposeful, the surface of the canvas alive with the marks of a hand moving across it in rhythms that were fast or slow, regular or irregular, but always present, always visible, always carrying in them something of the energy and the feeling of the person who made them. The swirling skies and the turbulent fields and the vibrating surfaces of his St. Remy paintings are not descriptions of things he saw but transformations of things he saw into a visual language that had its own grammar and its own expressive range, a language that could say things about the quality of experience, about what it felt like to be alive and looking and feeling in a particular time and place, that no conventional descriptive painting could quite say. The Starry Night, painted in June of 1889 from his room at St. Remy, looking out over the rooftops of the village below toward the dark hills beyond, is the most famous of these paintings, the most dramatic, the one in which the expressive potential of his style is most fully and most boldly realized. The sky in it is a great swirling sea of blue and ultramarine and white, the stars enormous, the night alive with a movement and an energy that has nothing to do with what the sky actually looks like and everything to do with what the sky feels like when you really pay attention to it, when you stand under it in the dark and let its enormousness work on you without trying to reduce it to something manageable. But there are also, in the St. Remy paintings, many works that are quieter and calmer than this, paintings of the hospital corridors and the patients in the garden and the view from his window in the morning light, paintings in which the same mastery of mark and color is put in service of subjects that are contemplative rather than dramatic, that communicate a kind of steady, patient looking rather than an overwhelming rush of sensation. He painted a series of copies after the artists he most admired, working from black and white reproductions that Theo sent from Paris, translating Millet's images of peasant labor and rest into color, finding in the familiar subjects of the Barbizon painter a continuity with his own deepest concerns, the concern with working people and honest labor and the connection between human beings and the land they worked. He painted his own version of Millet's The Sower, and his own version of The Reaper, and in doing so brought full circle something that had begun in the potato fields and the weaving cottages of North Brabant, the sustained meditation on the life of the earth and the people who worked it that ran through everything he had done since the Borinage. He left St. Remy in May of 1890 and travelled north, stopping briefly in Paris to see Theo and to meet Theo's wife Jo and their new baby son, who had been named Vincent Willem after his uncle, a gesture of love and faith that moved him deeply, and then continuing to Auvers-sur-Oise, a small village north of Paris on the Oise River, where the Dr. Paul Gachet, a physician and amateur painter who had treated other artists, had agreed to see him regularly and provide whatever support he could. Auvers was a beautiful and tranquil place, a village that several painters had already discovered and worked in, its rolling fields and poppy-strewn hillsides and thatched farmhouses providing exactly the kind of quiet, agricultural northern European landscape that he had first learned to love in North Brabant and that he was now seeing, after his years in the south, with entirely new eyes. The village stretched along the river in the valley below, its stone houses and walled gardens climbing gradually up the slope to the wide agricultural plateau above, where the fields opened out in every direction to the big, democratic, northern French sky that he had not painted for 2 years and that welcomed him back with the same patient, diffuse, grey-blue light he had known all his childhood. He rented a room in the inn of the Ravox family and settled into a routine of painting outdoors in the long June and July light, going out early in the mornings when the air was still cool and the light still soft, working through the day in the fields above the village, returning in the evenings for a simple meal and early bed. The room above the cafe was small and low-ceilinged, with a narrow bed and a wooden table and a single window that looked out onto the square below, and it had exactly the spare simplicity that he preferred in his living quarters, exactly the feeling of a space meant for sleeping and resting rather than for anything elaborate, a space that made no demands and asked nothing more than the occupancy of a body at rest. He kept his brushes and paints and canvases in the room and spent his evenings there writing letters and reading and looking at the drawings he had made during the day, considering what he would do differently tomorrow, what angle he had not yet tried, what hour of the light he had not yet been present for. Dr. Gogh received him with genuine warmth, inviting him to Sunday lunches at his house in the village, a cluttered and friendly house full of paintings and cats and the friendly disorder of a man who collected things because he loved them rather than because he was organizing them, and these Sundays became a pleasant and grounding feature of the Orvers weeks, an anchor of human warmth in the midst of the solitary intensity of the working days. Gogh was genuinely interested in him both as a patient and as an artist, and the interest was mutual. He painted Gogh's portrait, a painting that shows the doctor leaning on a table with his head resting in his hand, looking out at the painter with an expression that combines melancholy and intelligence and a kind of searching quality, as if even in the act of being painted he is thinking about something serious, working through something that requires his full attention. He painted in the tall wheat fields above the village on mornings when the light was gold and the air was full of the sound of insects and the distant voices of farmers somewhere across the plain, and he painted in the rain, setting up his easel under a tree and watching the grey sheets of water move across the fields in successive waves, the landscape dissolving and reassembling in the rain with a quality of soft, continuous change that was entirely different from the hard clarity of Provence, but entirely beautiful in its own way. He painted the village rooftops from above, a bird's-eye view of the thatched and tiled roofs of Orvers spread below him like a patchwork, each roof a different color and a different texture, the whole thing held together by the grey-blue sky above and the winding roads below. A view that combined the particular and the general in the way that all his best work did, the specific details of a specific place combining into something that felt representative of a larger truth about the way human settlements arrange themselves in landscapes. He painted Orvers with extraordinary speed and intensity, producing over 80 paintings in the 70 days he spent there, more than one a day, working with a kind of urgency and also a kind of peace that coexisted strangely but completely. The paintings of Orvers are different from those of Saint Remy, different in their subject matter, quieter subjects, the village church scene from the fields, the thatched roofs and garden walls, the rain, the long stretches of field under wide skies, and also different in their mood, which is more meditative, more contained, the swirling energies of some of the Arles and Saint Remy paintings replaced by something slower and more level, as if the painter had found in this northern light and this northern landscape something that asked for a quieter response. He painted the village church at Orvers, the old stone building rising above the surrounding houses against a sky of deep blue, the path in front of it dividing into two as it passes the church, and the whole scene lit with the particular quality of northern French summer light that is entirely different from the hard, clear light of Provence, softer and more diffuse and in some ways more subtle, a light that asks for different colors and different marks and gets them. He painted the wheat fields above the village under skies that were sometimes blue and peaceful and sometimes turbulent and dramatic, the wheat moving in the wind, the crows rising from the fields, the distant hills fading into the summer haze, and everything he painted had in it the quality of full, serious, loving attention, the quality of someone who was looking at the world as if he might not have forever to look at it and did not want to miss anything. He wrote to Theo and to Joe with great affection during these weeks, writing about what he was seeing and painting, about the beauty of the Orvers countryside and the kindness of Dr. Gogh and the pleasure of being back in the north after the years in the south. He was not unhappy. He was working and he was alive to the world around him and he was making beautiful things, and these were the conditions he needed. And for 70 days in the summer of 1890 those conditions were present and he used them completely. On the 27th of July, 1890, Vincent van Gogh went out into the fields above Orvers and was fatally wounded, and he died 2 days later in the early morning of the 29th of July, with his brother Theo at his bedside. He was 37 years old. He left behind him, in 10 years of serious artistic work, over 900 paintings and more than 1,000 drawings, a body of work that is one of the great achievements of Western art, one of the most complete and honest records of a human being's encounter with the visible world that has ever been set down in paint and paper. But let us not end there, in those final days of July, with their irreversible weight. Let us go back instead to the fields and the light, to the long mornings in Provence and the evening walks in North Brabant, to the smell of paint and turpentine in a small studio and the sound of brushes moving across canvas and the particular quality of attention that is needed to really look at something, to see it not just glancingly but deeply, to see the light falling on it and the color it actually is rather than the color you expect it to be, to see the individual brushstroke of nature's painting of a thing, the specific curve of a leaf, the exact angle of a shadow, the precise gradation of color in a sky moving from horizon to zenith. Let us go back to the parsonage garden in Zundert on a summer evening, the last of the light still warm and golden in the tops of the old trees, the smell of the roses his mother tended drifting through the open window of the house, the flat land beyond the village fading into a soft gray haze where the sky meets the earth without drama, without emphasis, in the way that the Dutch landscape always does, quietly and without fuss, as if it has been doing this for 1,000 years and will do it for 1,000 more and sees no reason to call attention to the fact. Let us go back to the room in The Hague where a young man sits at a table in the lamplight with a drawing on the paper before him and a print by Millet pinned to the wall and the sound of the rain on the window outside and the sense of someone who is learning, steadily and patiently, how to do the thing he was made to do, learning it the way all deep learning happens, through failure and correction and the accumulation of small improvements that are each individually invisible but collectively transformative, the way a path is worn into the earth not by any single pair of feet but by every pair of feet that has ever walked that way, each journey leaving its small contribution to the gradual deepening of the track. Let us go back to the orchard at Arles in the early spring of 1888, when the almond trees were in blossom and the air was still cold from the winter but the light was already shifting toward something warmer and more southern, and a man stood at his easel in the morning brightness painting the white and pink of the blossom against the pale blue of the Provençal sky with brushstrokes that were quick and confident and full of joy. The joy of someone who has arrived in a place that is exactly right for them, who has found the light they have been looking for and is now standing in it, painting as fast as they can because the blossom is beautiful and the moment is passing and there is no time to waste. He did this for 10 years, every day, with enormous dedication and enormous joy, even through the difficult times, even through the loneliness and the doubt and the episodes of illness, even through all the ordinary human difficulties that come to any life lived with intensity and sincerity. He looked at the world with the fullest attention he could bring to bear on it, and he translated what he saw and felt into paintings that carry that attention forward in time, that make it available to anyone who stands before them, that offer to the person looking at them the experience of looking at the world through the eyes of someone who found it endlessly and overwhelmingly beautiful and who wanted, more than anything else in his life, to share that experience. There are certain moments in the history of art when a painting seems to go beyond the record of its making and become something else, something that has in it not just the skill and the intention of the artist but the actual presence of a life, the actual quality of a consciousness encountering the world. The paintings of Van Gogh do this with an immediacy and a directness that is almost physical, almost like standing beside him in the field or the garden or the cafe or the room in the asylum and feeling the light on your face and the paint smell in your nostrils and hearing the brush moving across the canvas in its quick, decisive strokes. And the effect is not nostalgia and not sentimentality, but something more like recognition. The recognition of a quality of experience that you yourself have had without quite having the language for it, the experience of the world as something alive and vibrating and full of light, something that asks for your full attention and repays it completely. The countryside of North Brabant still lies flat and wide under those enormous Dutch skies, the fields stretching to the horizon and the poplars standing in their long lines along the roads and the heather coming purple in August on the remaining stretches of moor and heath, and the light still comes low and sideways in the autumn afternoons the way it did when a red-haired boy from Zundert walked those roads with his quiet, attentive eyes open to everything. The orchards of Provence still bloom in late February and early March in the same ordered rows of pink and white blossom that he painted in that first spring in Arles, when everything was new and the light was astonishing and the painting came fast and confident and full of joy. The wheat fields above Orvers still turn gold in July and the crows still rise from them in long, dark, drifting curves against the wide French sky. And in the museums and galleries of the world, in Amsterdam and in New York and in Chicago and in London and in Tokyo and in countless smaller places where people go to stand before paintings and feel whatever it is that paintings make us feel, his work hangs on white walls in the steady light that curators have arranged to show it best, and people come to look. And they stand before the sunflowers and the starry nights and the potato eaters and the yellow house and the bedroom in Arles and the irises and the almond blossoms and the wheat fields, and they look, and something happens in them that is difficult to describe but not difficult to recognize, something that has to do with being reminded that the world is beautiful and that this beauty is available to anyone who is willing to pay attention, to slow down and really look, to follow the example of a man from Zundert who spent his short and earnest life learning to see and then trying, with all the skill and all the love he could bring to bear, to show others what he had seen. There is in his work a quality of generosity that is perhaps its most defining characteristic, the quality of someone who is not keeping the beauty to himself but offering it outward, offering it to anyone who comes to look, saying, "Here is what I saw, here is what the light was doing on this particular afternoon in this particular field, here is what the color of the sky looked like from this particular window at this particular hour. Here is a face and here is a flower and here is a field and here is the night sky above a sleeping town, and all of it is more beautiful than I can quite say, and I have tried to say it anyway, in paint, in the only language I have for it, and if you will stand here and look with me for a little while, perhaps you will see it too." He painted the world as though it deserved to be painted, as though every ordinary thing, a pair of worn boots, a wooden chair, a vase of sunflowers on a yellow table, the view from a hospital window, the night sky above a river, the face of a tired old man, the body of a woman bent over her work in a field, was worth the same full, serious, loving attention that the grandest subjects had always received in the grand tradition of European painting. He democratized beauty, not by diminishing it but by expanding the territory in which it was expected to be found, by insisting that it was everywhere, available in everything, waiting to be noticed by anyone willing to look carefully enough and long enough and with enough genuine care for what was actually there. This was the work of his life, and it was, by any measure, an extraordinary life's work, produced in conditions that were often difficult, in a body that was not always cooperative, with materials that were modest and a budget that was never generous, in a series of small rooms and rented studios in provincial towns and cities. by a man who was largely unknown in his own lifetime and who sold almost none of what he made, but who painted anyway, every day, because painting was how he understood the world and how he loved it, and because he could not stop, and did not want to stop, and right up until the last days of his 37th year was still going out into the fields with his easel and his colors and his irresistible, unconquerable need to look and to paint and to make the looking into something that would last. Let the light of those paintings rest quietly in your mind now, as you allow the thoughts of the day to slow and settle and grow still. The yellow of the sunflowers, warm and soft. The blue of the night sky above the Rhone, deep and peaceful. The pale pink of the almond blossoms against the winter sky, gentle and full of promise. The golden warmth of a lamp in a dark room, where a family sits together at a simple table. The grey-green of a Dutch field in autumn, quiet and wide and open to the sky. Let these colors move slowly through the mind like clouds across the sky of Provence, unhurried, without destination, simply present in the moment of their passing. Let the brushstrokes settle into stillness. Let the fields grow quiet and the light grow soft and the great turning world slow down to its natural pace, which is slower than we usually allow ourselves to notice, slower and more steady and more full of beauty than we usually have the time to see. Vincent van Gogh looked at the world with full attention for 10 years, and what he found there was light, and color, and the stubborn, patient dignity of ordinary life, and the enormous sky that arches over all of it, day and night, in every season, whether we are looking or not. He looked, and he painted what he saw, and the paintings remain, full of the looking, full of the life, full of the particular quality of one man's complete and wholehearted encounter with the beauty of the world. Rest now in that light. Let the colors settle around you like the soft fall of petals from an almond tree in early spring, each one landing silently on the quiet earth. The sky above us is deep and still, full of stars that burn with a gentle, steady light, and the village below is sleeping, and the fields beyond are sleeping, and the great world beyond the fields is sleeping too, turning slowly in its ancient dark, carrying all its light and all its color and all its beautiful ordinary things through the long and tranquil night, toward morning. Breathe slowly. Let the brushstrokes blur and soften at the edges. Let the yellow house recede gently into the evening shadows. Let the Rhone run quietly to the sea. Let the cypresses stand still in the windless dark. Let the wheat fields lie still and gold and full of rest beneath the wide and patient sky. You are drifting now through a painting that has no edges and no frame, a painting that goes on in every direction as far as you can see, full of soft light and gentle color and the sound of nothing at all, just the distant, barely audible sound of a brush moving across canvas, slow and rhythmic and entirely peaceful, marking the quiet passage of one long and beautiful day into another long and beautiful night, and everything is still, and everything is well, and you are resting now, and the light is very gentle, and the colors are fading slowly into the soft, encompassing blue of sleep, and all is calm, and all is quiet, and the stars are out, and the world is at rest, and you are resting with it, drifting slowly and peacefully and without any effort at all into the deep and dreamless dark, where even the paint has dried and even the light has stilled and even the great turning world has settled, for a little while, into silence.